What if Gojo had an open domain expansion? Let's talk about it, but spoilers beware. Alright, so first of all, shout out to Otsukare who asked me about this and wanted to know what might have happened had Gojo had an open domain in his fight with Sukuna. So let's break this down. First of all, let's just talk about what Gojo having an open domain would mean for him in general. And we know that this is a divine level feat, right? The narrator equated it to painting on thin air. So obviously it's impressive, but realistically, the only thing Gojo gains from this would be a potentially wider range for his domain expansion. Because we know that one of the things Sukuna gains from his open domain is an effective radius of nearly 200 meters, and that's thanks to the fact that there's a binding vow that provides an escape path from the domain. So since he allows people a theoretical way to get out of his domain, he can make it bigger. So similarly, Gojo could probably benefit from the same thing, right? If he figured out how to do an open domain, the effective radius of his domain should increase. And honestly, that's even better for Gojo than it is for Sukuna, because you could theoretically survive the slashes of Malevolent Shrine, assuming you can heal or something, right? But Unlimited Void, it just stuns you instantly, right? You become a vegetable. So whether or not you have an escape route doesn't really matter because you're just going to be stunned where you are either way. So the main benefit Gojo has is that he could increase his effective range without really losing output or anything. And then the other important thing Gojo would gain from an open domain is the fact that there would no longer be a barrier that could be destroyed either from the outside like we saw with Sukuna's slashes or from the inside like we saw with Maharaga. And that's because an open barrier domain technically still has a barrier, but it's just not closed. Right? You could think of it as kind of like laying flat on the surface. So there isn't really something that you can physically attack to destroy it. This is why Gojo just had to beat the brakes off Sukuna himself in order to destroy the domain instead of attacking the barrier itself. Okay, so what if Gojo came into this fight with an open domain, or like Otsukare suggested, developed an open domain mid-fight? What would have happened? And there's a bunch of things we need to consider here. First and foremost, refinement, which is like the most nebulous statistic when it comes to domains, but it's also the most important, right? Because we're told whoever's domain is more refined will win the clash. Meaning, if your domain is more refined, you will destroy the other person's domain and just take over. This is why Gojo and Sukuna were able to have a simultaneous domain clash, because they were said to be exactly equal in their refinement, which is interesting because Gojo has a closed domain, right? So Gojo's closed domain is just as refined as Sukuna's open domain. So if we hypothetically give Gojo an open domain now, does that mean he's even more refined than Sukuna at this point? Or does simply having an open domain not necessarily make it more refined, right? And there's really no way to answer that. So it could be that Gojo developing an open domain would increase his refinement, which means he would just win the domain clash now, and the fight would be over, right? Because Sukuna would be out of luck. However, if we want to say that open versus closed doesn't necessarily impact refinement, then they would still be equal and the clash would still continue, right? And if that's the case, then now we have two open domains existing at the same time, which doesn't really make sense the same way a closed and an open existing at the same time does. Which, honestly, at the end of the day, on a meta level, I think this is why Gege Akutami didn't give Gojo an open domain, because it's much easier to conceptualize and have an interesting back and forth with one of them being closed and one of them being open, right? It provides this interesting dynamic of Sukuna attacking from the outside and Gojo having to, destroy him within the time limit. So I think ultimately the narrative is why Gojo never did this, because this was a much more interesting scenario to play with. It might be that two open domains can't coexist, because what, would they just lie on top of each other? You know what I mean? But again, let's assume that they could, right? In that scenario, I now believe that it would just be like them both standing on both of their domains, I guess, and the sure hits would be canceling each other out just like they were in the original battle, except this time, Sukuna would have no recourse. He wouldn't be able to destroy Gojo's barrier with slashes like he did against his closed domain, right? So it would just come down to the hand-to-hand. Like whoever could damage the other more fast enough to make the other one drop their domain would win. So it would just be a battle of the hands and who could force the other to drop their domain first. Now, in the version of the battle we got, Gojo dominated the hand-to-hand, but in this hypothetical version, it might not go like this, right? Because Sukuna's strategy would have to be different. Maybe he would go to his true form sooner, like we really don't know, right? But the point is, the battle would now be who could damage the other physically within their stalemated open domains. So to circle us all the way back around, if Gojo has an open domain, he either just wins the domain clash because now he's more refined, or both their domains just cancel out because it's impossible to have two open domains coexisting, or three, they can coexist, they lie on top of each other, cancel out the sure hits, and it's just a battle of hands to see who can damage the other fast enough to force their domain to fall. And then while we're talking about open domains, I got a few questions about them from Cassini here, starting with this one that asks, do I think an open domain could be cast and left in an area almost like a trap for people? And 100%, because we actually pretty much see this with Sukuna and Haruta. Haruta kind of steps into the area of the domain, not realizing what he's stepping into, and he regrets it, right? So yes, Sukuna was like literally right there, but I think this is enough precedent to show that if Sukuna wanted, he could maintain his domain and walk like 6 blocks in another direction, and anybody that just so happened to walk into Malevolent Shrine is still going to get got. And then Cassini asked me 2 more questions that kind of go hand in hand. He first says, could it be that open domains are more likely to come from techniques that don't require a physical form, like Sukuna's slashes or potentially Kenjaku's gravity? And I don't think so. I think that any technique could theoretically have an open domain. I don't think the barrier being closed helps or hinders like specific techniques based on if they have like a corporeal form or not. This could cite back to the anchor idea of open domains, which I've talked about before. Like instead of having the closed barrier that kind of contains that extra dimensional space, you could think of the central anchor in an open domain being a gravity well that is like containing everything within its area. So I think that whether or not your technique has a physical form doesn't have any bearing on it. And that leads into Cassini's other question, which was, which techniques do I think have the potential for an open domain to be inherited? And because you used the word inherited there, I'm not sure what you meant by that necessarily, but I don't think anyone has an open domain inherited, like that naturally has an open domain with their technique. I purely think that this is a function of skill, that you need to be refined enough or, again, skilled enough to do this, to paint on air. So I think anyone could have an open domain, regardless of technique. It's just a matter of their jujutsu genius. And then AJ asked me a few questions, starting with what would I consider the pinnacle of jujutsu? And he lists a few things here, but honestly, in my opinion, I would say domain expansion and RCT, because those are the 2 rarest things a sorcerer can possess. And if somebody has both, they're the cream of the crop, right? And then AJ goes on to ask, what would I consider Sukuna's world cutting slash? Is that a maximum output technique? Is that a maximum technique? And honestly, I don't think it's either. I don't think it really fits the metric for what a maximum technique is. Now, we don't really see many maximum techniques in general, but I don't think it fits the formula, right? Because it is just his slash, but he's enhanced it with what he learned from Maharaga. So I think it's just, his normal technique, but boosted in a way pretty much unique to him, right? And I also don't really think it's a maximum output technique either. It's hard to say like what his output in the world cutting slash is. Like maybe it is his maximum for all we know, but I think that's just kind of like the brilliance of this technique. It cuts existence, right? So kind of almost regardless of its output, it's going to cut whatever, right? Now, maybe it also just requires a maximum output to do something like that. And then the next thing AJ brings up is rule-bending JiuJitsu. And y'all can pause to read the full thing here, but he's referring to ways that you basically cheat the system. Like when Gojo destroyed his own brain and healed it to get around curse technique burnout. Or when Sukuna, in his domain expansion, had his curse technique still active, but then he used domain amplification. So he was kind of getting the benefits of curse technique and domain amp at the same time, which is usually impossible. He wanted to know if there's any other examples of this I could think of. Honestly, binding vows encapsulate this to a T, right? It's all about finding a way to cheat the system. Like we saw with Sukuna's world cutting slash against Gojo. He kind of gave some things up in the future where it wasn't really going to matter as much in order to get a freebie world cutting slash to catch Gojo off guard. So, you're genius in the way you could use binding vows to create situational advantages like that, I think is the best example of cheating that there is in JJK. But beyond that, I would also say open domains are a pretty good example of this because, you're technically giving your opponent an escape route, but like 99.9% of people, it's not going to be relevant for. So all you're getting is a pretty awesome advantage, right? Also, the benefit of not having a barrier that can be destroyed anymore. So other than all sorts of ways you can use binding vows, open domains, and kind of the examples you already listed, I'm not sure what else there might be. And then AJ's final question points to Kusakab as being an example of somebody that could master jujitsu without a curse technique just by practicing the fundamentals. And totally, right? He was considered the strongest grade 1 sorcerer, and that's just because of how good he was with his simple domain and new shadow style school. But AJ goes on to say that you could maybe develop a curse technique after mastering those things, or perhaps have a technique manifest after some point. And that's where I'd have to disagree. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that you can just create a curse technique out of nothing, at least based on what we know from the show, right? You have to be born with one is like a fundamental thing that was drilled into us. Obviously, there are some crazy exceptions, like what we saw with Yuji, but barring stuff like that, I don't think you can hard work your way to a curse technique. And then another thing AJ says on top of this, with switch training, could you theoretically get a curse technique? And this is something I actually talked about in a recent video, so I'm going to link that to your comment. But no, I don't think so. Basically, because when you're swap training, you're just like an essence of a soul, so there's nothing like that could get ingrained on you. Like Kusakab in Megami's body, for example, could use 10 shadows while he's there, but he's not going to be bringing the 10 shadows back with him into his body. And Megami in Kusakabe's body doesn't bring the 10 shadows with him, right? So he doesn't get to like use 10 shadows in Kusakabe's body. You got to be in the body with a curse technique to use the curse technique, and there's no like bringing that home with you. So no, I don't think any amount of switch training could get you a curse technique. Not the same way that like Yuji got Sukuna's curse technique, right? Because that's because Sukuna brought his curse technique with him into Yuji's body, and that's the main difference there. And then speaking of Kusakab, Professor asked me if Kusakab had a domain expansion, what do I think it would do? And again, I don't think it's possible for Kusakab to ever have a domain expansion, and if he did, it would need to be based on a curse technique that he somehow attained, right? So, I don't think he can have one. But in What If Wonderland, if we're just going to conceive one that fits his style, then I think it would be something that has to do with his swordplay, right? And I even came up with this idea for Miwa in a previous video, but I thought it would be cool if like in her domain, it was just, everything was stripped away and it was just a sword battle, which would obviously favor somebody with swordsman skills. So I think something like that would be cool for Kusakab. But again, beyond that, like it would all depend on what his curse technique is, right? But I definitely see something cool with swordplay with him. And then Professor asked me, beginning of series Yuji versus 100 men and a polar bear, who would win? And I gotta go with the 100 men and the polar bear. Yuji is built different, his physicals are off the charts, but before he gets, Sukuna's cursed energy and learns sorcery, he's just an enhanced human, right? And maybe he could take the 100 dudes by himself, but honestly, I don't think he could. I think he would run out of stamina. But we're throwing a polar bear on top of that. They are vicious, bro. So Yuji's getting clapped. And then Professor's final question is Kashima with Domain Amp versus Pre-Awakened Teen Gojo. And Kashima slams. This is like heavily favored in his direction, right? Because Pre-Awakened Teen Gojo can't heal, no red, no purple, no domain, right? Basically, all he's got is the infinity and blue, and Kashima with Domain Amp has a way through infinity, so he slams. And then finally, speaking of Kashima, I want to shout out Corey, who sent in a comment with no question, but he just said he thinks it would be cool if Kashima did have a domain expansion, that in there he could use his technique multiple times without it killing him. So thank you so much for the support, man. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one, y'all. Thank you guys so much for the questions, and as always, thank you for watching.